it takes more than us inside of Gaza to change things. We really need everybody to wake up and to actually do something about it, not just talk about it or look away.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battle Lines. It's Monday, October 28th, 2024.
We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
President Zelensky has for the first time acknowledged that his forces are conducting a cross-border offensive inside Russia.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
Welcome back to another episode focused on the latest in the Middle East, including everything you need to know about Israel's retaliatory strike on Iran and what could happen next. We'll also be chatting to an MSF doctor in Gaza to get the latest from there, including an in-depth look at what's really going on in the north of the Strip amid Israel's ongoing siege. Let's begin with a catch-up of the latest death tolls, both civilian and military, including and since October 7th, 2023. Gaza's death toll is more than 42,900 people, Lebanon is more than 2,650 people, and Israel is at least 1,610 people. So, Roland, after several weeks of waiting, this weekend we finally had Israel's response to Iran's salvo of rockets from earlier this month. What do we know?
Well, Israeli jets, exactly how many I'm not sure. People are saying scores. Lots of Israeli jets carried out 3 waves of strikes before dawn on Saturday against missile factories and other sites near Tehran and in western Iran. That's from Israel's military. They said they hit about 20 targets, including missile manufacturing facilities, surface-to-air missiles, and other military sites. So a combination of air defense sites, which allows the Israelis to, or give them greater depth if they want to go back and do another mission again, but also some interesting kind of military manufacturing sites, which we'll get into in a second. The Iranians said that the Israeli aircraft fired, here's their quote, a small number of long-range missiles from a distance inside US patrolled airspace over Iraq. And the death toll, the Iranians say that, well, they initially said that 4 soldiers had been killed while battling projectiles. So that sounds like the crew of these air defense systems that were hit. This morning, Monday morning, Iranian news agencies are now also reporting 1 civilian fatality. So with that out of the way, what exactly was hit? Well, the Iranians have been fairly cagey about it. They just said that sites in Tehran, Khuzestan, and Ilam provinces, so Tehran's more or less in the center north of Iran, and the other 2 are provinces kind of over in the west towards the Iraqi border. And it said the air defense had successfully intercepted the attacks, but some areas sustained limited damage, so not much detail there. The US and the IAEA have confirmed that none of Iran's nuclear facilities were hit, and neither was the oil infrastructure, which the Israelis were definitely thinking about, but the Americans didn't want them to do. But this is where it gets interesting. So what was actually hit? Well, BBC Verify said they identified some damage to a defense ministry base to the east of Tehran and an air defense base to the south. The AP verified these photos of damage at a military base at a place called Parchin. Now, that's a place where the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, suspects that in the past, Iran conducted tests of high explosives that could trigger a nuclear weapon there. So it's not... in some places, you're going to see this reported as a nuclear test site. That would suggest they're exploding nuclear weapons. They haven't. This is the site where we think they tested the trigger mechanism, right? The high explosives that is meant to compress the uranium to create the nuclear explosion, but not the actual full complete bomb. Now, this came from, amongst other people, David Albright, a former UN inspector, head of the Institute for Science and International Security. And he said one of the buildings hit in Parchin, you can see on these satellite photos, is a building that has been labeled Talagan 2, and that had been formerly used for this kind of testing. There's also photographs taken on Sunday morning by a satellite firm called Planet Labs, and that showed another strike destroyed 2 buildings at the Kozhir base, which is nearby. And that's where analysts believe that solid fuel for ballistic missiles was mixed. So you get an interesting picture here. The Israelis definitely haven't hit the actual enrichment plants, the reactors, all that stuff, but they're definitely hitting what you might call the kind of downstream stuff in the kind of military supply line that if you wanted to weaponize, you would want to use. And I just note here, Western intelligence agencies and others say Tehran had an active weapons program until 2003. So the idea is if you hit this stuff that was used back then, they think it makes it more difficult to de-mothball that That's the theory. And we have confirmation from this in a way. This is an Israeli defense analyst. I'm just going to read through who's explaining this targeting. This is a guy called Roland Oliphant talking to the Telegraph over the weekend. I'll just read out his quote. The Israeli idea is to cut the supply of ballistic missiles to use against Israel and in the end prevent Iran building a nuclear warhead. The attack allowed Israel to bypass the veto from the West on hitting Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities, such as at Natanz. This wasn't a nuclear facility, as Iran called it a military facility, so that gave Israel a green light to attack it. Israel couldn't target the enrichment, so it targeted the integration of the missile, the trigger of the bomb for the head of the missile, which is being tested at Taligan. So that gives us some idea of what they hit besides those air defense points.
You alluded to this, but the air defense systems that they hit, weren't some of them near oil facilities and port facilities, in a suggestion that they might be softening Iran up for potential future attacks?
There were reports of an explosion near an oil facility near the Iraqi border, and it wasn't confirmed whether those explosions were connected to the airstrikes and so on and so forth. But certainly that signal is there. And, the Israelis are always looking to expand their room for maneuver, perhaps, in the skies above Iran. And they've talked about it very openly. Like, if we ever do this, the first thing we're going to hit will be the air defenses. And you can see Jonathan Conrickas, the former IDF spokesman, was on, I think, CNN, a month or two ago, basically laying that out. Right? So it's not a surprise that they would do that. Yes, they want to leave that door open if they want to go back. The initial reaction from Iran was quite muted in a way, and it kind of raised hopes that this could be the end of this particular round of escalation. In fact, I'll just get into it. So this is Masoud Pezeshkian, the president. He told his cabinet Iran did not want war, but would deliver what he called an appropriate response. Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, said Tehran had received indications hours before the attack, which that coincides with reporting from Axios, actually, that Israel did provide a warning so as to prevent a wider escalation, which, by the way, is what we think also happened when Iran struck Israel back at the beginning of October. Right? So playing by the rules here in a way. And then the real decision maker, this is Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, speaking on Sunday after the strikes, said that, look, the Israelis are exaggerating what they achieved, but although the enemy's exaggerating, it would be foolish for us to downplay it as well. We should just address what happened. We shouldn't downplay it or exaggerate it. So he acknowledged what happened. But these are all remarks that were taken as a sign that they're not particularly hawkish, not kind of vowing the nuclear option. In fact, this morning, Monday morning, I'm talking about, when markets opened, oil prices dropped slightly on that reflection of confidence, relative confidence or relief in the market. But then you've got the head of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, a little bit more fiery, again speaking this morning. Israel failed to achieve its ominous goals, a sign of miscalculation and helplessness. It will face bitter consequences that will be unimaginable for Israel. So on and so forth. So a slight turning up of the rhetoric there. And I've just been looking at the Supreme Leader's Twitter, and he has been putting out a few more things. He's complaining about the United Nations. International organizations like the United Nations truly aren't doing their duty with regard to the issue of confronting the Zionist regime, but nothing there to suggest really an imminent and enormous and disproportionate response, which I think will raise hopes that this particular round of the tennis match may be over. We don't know.
Do we know anything more about why Israel took so long to respond?
Partly, of course, they're going to be planning it, but I think really this was a political thing. They were under massive pressure from their allies, the United States, about this. The Americans have made no secret of the fact that they did not want, let's say, what did they do? They specifically, in concrete terms, they didn't want strikes on the nuclear facilities and they didn't want strikes on the oil facilities, which a lot of people in Israel were calling for. Why not? Because the Americans felt like that would trigger perhaps an even bigger response from the Iranians. That would be seen by the Iranians as a step up the escalation ladder, and therefore, maybe you would see, say, 1,000 rockets fired at Israel instead of the 200 odd we saw earlier this month, which might overwhelm Israel's missile defenses. You might see a massive escalation of proxy activity in the Red Sea with the Houthis, in Iraq against American bases. We've been talking since the beginning of this crisis about preventing escalation to all-out war, and it becomes a little bit. You'd be forgiven for asking, well, if this isn't all-out war, what is? I think the answer to your question is a lot of people feel that there still is a much worse scenario that they're trying to hold the world back from, and I think you can actually see in some of the reaction in Israel following this, the sense that Netanyahu finally kind of bowed to American pressure on this. And certainly coming out of Washington, some remarks that suggest the White House is pretty satisfied with this.
Can you tell us anything more about how this attack has been received in Israel? Are the Israeli hardliners happy?
Not really. I mean, okay, so Benjamin Netanyahu, speaking after the operation, praises it, says it was precise and powerful, achieving all its objectives. Lots of universal praise for the performance of the Air Force, as you'd expect. But no, going into this, there was a lot of public discussion in Israel about, look, we've got a historic opportunity now. The door is open. We can actually finally do that raid we've been talking about for decades and just wipe out the Iranian nuclear program. Or even we can hit their oil facilities, really give their economy a massive kicking. Some people thinking that's the kind of punishment they deserve to show it. And some people even speculating that maybe you do that, you cause chaos in Iran, you bring down the regime, right? Which I think is a few steps, making a few kind of imaginative leaps to get there. But no, look, here's some response. There's a lot of analysis in the Israeli press over the weekend and today about whether or not an opportunity was missed, because that was a live debate. From the right, you've got Avigdor Lieberman, hawkish former defense minister, saying that Iran's going to continue to try to obtain nuclear arms and spending the profits from its oil sales on its proxies and so on, and said that the government has satisfied itself with the public relations actions. You've got Knesset member Tali Gottlieb of the Likud party, a very right-wing figure. She said that the attack represented a surrender to the Biden administration, which does not think for a moment about Israel's interests. She said, not attacking Iran's nuclear facilities nor reserves is a serious mistake. We missed an opportunity to weaken Iran's potential from becoming a nuclear power for many years. Now, she's quite a loudmouth. This is a woman who publicly advocated dropping a nuclear weapon on Gaza last year. But it's not just the far right. Yair Lapid, leader of the opposition, a centrist. He also wrote on Twitter, the decision not to attack strategic and economic targets in Iran was wrong. We could and should have exacted a much heavier price from Iran. But then here's Yair Golan. He leads a merger of the Meretz and Labour Party, so of the Israeli left. Says actually this was praised it, harming Iran's defensive and offensive capabilities without dragging us into a war of attrition. The American pressure succeeded, or perhaps the military's voice of reason worked for a change. He said, now we can go back to dealing with the more important thing, and that is a hostage deal in Gaza. So those are a range of reactions there, but you're absolutely right to raise it, because there definitely were. There was a sense, and it was publicly discussed, that maybe this is the opportunity to either finally destroy the Iranian nuclear program or even decapitate the regime. The Americans clearly nervous about anyone trying to do that and how far that could go wrong. And clearly the American pressure has paid off. And in fact, an unnamed member of the Biden administration briefed reporters after this who basically said, look, we've been talking to the Israelis over the past several weeks, urging them to conduct a response that would be targeted, proportional, and with low risk of civilian harm. And the quotation that was put out in the press, that appears to be precisely what transpired.
You mentioned Gaza, and we're shortly going to hear from an MSF doctor who's working out there. The ceasefire talks appear to have resumed. What can you tell us?
So Sunday, the day after the strikes in Iran, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, president of Egypt, came up with a new proposal for a ceasefire. Now, what he's proposing is a 2-day truce in Gaza and a limited hostage exchange. And the idea is that's a stepping stone, right? So it's meant to secure a complete ceasefire further on. So the proposal, basically, the idea would be Hamas would give up 4 Israeli hostages held in Gaza in exchange for Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. And then you'd be followed by more negotiations within 10 days. This is what he laid out at a news conference in Cairo yesterday. He didn't say whether he formally presented that plan to the two sides, to Hamas or to Israel. But what we do know is that the same day, Israeli, American, and Egyptian spy chiefs all flew into Qatar for talks. Now, this shouldn't surprise you, because actually the spy chiefs have been the kind of key diplomats leading the talks, which weirdly enough is often the case in this kind of thing. But so the head of Mossad, David Barnea, Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, Hassan Mahmoud Rashad, the head of Egyptian intelligence, all flew into Qatar, I think, yesterday for talks. It's the first peace talks, I think, ceasefire talks since August, with the exception of the Egyptian intelligence chief who's new. These guys have all been involved in talks before. We don't have any update on the outcome of those discussions as yet. But it does come last week, about a week ago, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, did say that the US is proposing a temporary ceasefire as a test for Hamas. So kind of a way of seeing, basically a way of seeing whether, and if so, to what degree Hamas's stance has changed following the killing of Yahya Sinwar, its leader. So that's what he said. He said it would be a short ceasefire accompanied by limited hostage release. So it sounds like he's talking about the same thing that President Sisi is talking about, but we don't have any further details at the moment of how that's going.
Since October 6th, earlier this month, the Israeli military has been besieging northern Gaza. It's been relentlessly bombing places such as Jabalia, Beit Lahia, and Beit Hanun, and preventing almost any food, water, fuel, or aid from entering. Footage from the north shows an apocalyptic, nightmarish landscape. Everything's grey, no buildings left undamaged, smoke billowing in the sky, and people wandering amid the rubble. It looks unlivable. The Israeli military operation has so far killed at least 1,000 Palestinians. Many in the besieged areas have described dead bodies lying in the streets and people trapped beneath the rubble, with first responders no longer able to work without being bombed. Around 400,000 people had chosen to stay in the north rather than become refugees forced to live in tents with no guarantee of safety. But last week, the Israeli army released videos showing soldiers rounding up thousands of Palestinians and forcing them southward towards Gaza City. Now, UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, has estimated that 20,000 people were displaced just in one day from Jabalia on October 18th. There have also been multiple reports of the men being separated from their families as they flee. That's prompted speculation that Israel is implementing the so-called General's Plan, which we've discussed on this podcast previously, essentially forcing the local population to surrender or starve. Israel says such actions are necessary to prevent Hamas from regrouping. Amid all of this, 3 hospitals are just about limping on, providing what little healthcare they can. I wanted to get a better understanding of what's actually going on, so I spoke to Karin Huster. She's Médecins Sans Frontières' medical team leader in Gaza, and she's currently working in Nasser Hospital, much further south in Khan Yunis. Here's our conversation.
What is happening right now in the north, in the last 2 weeks, the north, so Jabalia and Beit Lahia, the conditions there have been undescribably horrible. And then this is where you've had incursions by the Israeli army into field hospitals, into hospitals like Indonesian hospital, into Auda, into Kamal Adwan. And now in North Gaza, you have one hospital that's barely functional, that's Kamal Adwan, but that has been left with only 2 physicians and 10 nurses now to function with 147 patients. Their bed capacity there is less than 65. Structural damage to the place has been significant. The Israeli forces have targeted generators, oxygen tanks. They've also taken 44 of Kamal Adwan staff, leaving it in pretty much a non-functional state. Indonesian hospital, which was one of the biggest hospitals in that very northern part of Gaza, has been again shut down. It had been shut down earlier in the war, and it was able to restart the emergency department and as well 120 beds, but now it's not functional. And then Al-Aud is also beyond description. So what is happening is you have people who are unable to access any facility that might be, semi-functional. The roads are completely destroyed. You have patients who are left dying on the streets. You have women who are giving birth on the streets, who have no way to reach any facility whatsoever. You have no staff in the facilities. You have very little supplies. WHO was able to do one mission to Kamal Adwan 3 days ago, I believe, 3 or 4 days ago. They were able to bring 200 blood units. They were able to bring some supplies. They were able to bring 10,000 liters of fuel. But this is a drop in the ocean. It's better than nothing. But really, I think what we're seeing is a clear attempt of the Israeli forces to make the hospitals in the north non-functional. And so it's forcing the population to go to Gaza City, which itself has had, all its health facilities destroyed. Shifa Hospital, as you know, was the largest hospital in Palestine with over 750 beds. It has been destroyed many times, rendered dysfunctional. And so now the Ministry of Health, WHO, has been trying to transfer some of the most critically injured patients from Kamal Adwan, from Al-Auda Hospital, into Shifa, even though Shifa is hardly a place for people to receive, the care that they need. It's a lot of people who have been hit by shrapnel, people who have been victims of, buildings that have been collapsing on them. It's just the usual trauma, war trauma that we have been seeing in Gaza, right? So it'll be very severe orthopedic injuries, it'll be burns, it'll be the same things we see when Israel, attacks a building and destroys a building, and the collateral damage that happens from that, because people live in those places. You see as well, people, if they are able to reach with any other kind of conditions, but predominantly, and those who need the help most critically, are those, who have been injured by war incidents.
It must take extraordinary courage for these doctors and nurses and other medical workers to stay in a hospital with your patients while everyone is under bombardment. I mean, from your discussions with colleagues, Palestinian colleagues, how are they coping and keeping going through all of this?
I think your words are very just, but they are even an understatement of how resilient my colleagues are. As we discussed, Gaza, a Shifa hospital in Gaza City has been destroyed several times, and they come back and they rebuild. They are really resilient in wanting to make sure that the hospitals stand up again, even if they stand up with 5% of the capacity, that they are there for the people, for their people, to be able to access. It's more than commendable what they are doing, because they are doing this at great risk to themselves, as we saw in Kamal Adwan and as we saw in Shifa before. But they all have this one common quality, which is incredible resilience and commitment towards their people. Many have told me, I will not leave. I will stay, even if I have the opportunity to leave. I am staying, and we are going to rebuild the hospitals. We are going to make them work again.
How would you describe the health system in Gaza in general? It's sort of hard to imagine. We hear these, almost apocalyptic reports from outside. Has every hospital become just a giant A&E centre, or is there still capacity to treat other issues such as cancer and heart problems? And what sort of supplies do doctors have access to?
So the supplies, as you well know, has been an eternal battle for all of us responders. It's very dependent on the government of Israel's whim. One day we will get some trucks in, and then we won't be able to get any humanitarian supplies for a month. And so it's incredibly difficult to forecast and to meet the needs and even to scale up, right? So you do what you can. NGOs have been resorting to bartering between each other. I got this in, I got some morphine in, can you exchange with some normal saline? We try to make do. Sometimes you have to spread the frequency of surgeries or the frequency of wound dressing changes. You cope, you have to cope. There is no other choice for that. As to other services, it is true that we have been very focused on trauma, which is normal because this has been, the biggest culprit since this war started. But there are lots of people with chronic conditions, with cancer, with strokes, with heart attacks that are not able to be seen. To speak again about the resilience of the Palestinian healthcare staff, they in European hospital have, I think it's been maybe a couple months, they have been able to restart some level of oncology services there. So they're seeing breast cancer patients and other conditions, other cancers. I'm not able to tell you that they are seeing all cases, they have the medications that they need. Far from that. They're not able to send the patients that need it outside of Gaza to get the care. But at least the patients that back in January were pulling on my arm saying, please give me my drugs for my breast cancer, when I just only could look at them and saying, I'm so sorry, I don't have any of the cancer drugs. At least for those patients, there seems to be some hope. And I'll be a little bit personal here. I had breast cancer 4 years ago, so I can tell you that when I have these patients that pull at my arm to tell me, to beg me for drugs that I know are so easily available in the West, it just breaks my heart. So I was happy to learn that they have been able to restart to some degree oncology services at European General Hospital.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Karin. I'm sure it would be unimaginable to our listeners who have ever undergone cancer treatment themselves to be dealing with that in amidst this war. I wanted to ask as well about maternity wards. We've heard horror stories about C-sections being done without anesthesia or electricity. How widespread is that, and what sort of impact on babies and mothers are you seeing from the war?
Yeah, this is difficult. I haven't witnessed this myself. What I can tell you is that the maternity services that are available to women are vastly insufficient. And that there have been, back in January, February, when the Israeli forces were pounding on Khan Yunis, there were women who had just delivered maybe an hour before that were asked to get out of Nasser and walk towards the sea. So this we know happened. We also know that in the north for now, there have been women who have delivered on the street in the middle of the night because it is not possible to access those hospitals. The roads have been destroyed. Israeli forces are pounding the places. It's extremely dangerous to walk there. So women are delivering in abhorrent, unthinkable conditions. Also, I told you that a lot of the people now are living on the beach, literally on the beach, barely with mattresses, not even 50 centimeters of privacy between one another. And these women sometimes, maybe often, are delivering there because it's not safe to go to the hospital at night. And that is not something that was happening before the war. The people of Gaza were just like us. They had an incredibly working health system, incredibly educated healthcare workers. Everybody was delivering in hospitals. The standard of care was high, and they are learning that this is no longer available. And even in the places where it might be available, it's difficult for them to reach. But we have restarted. We have one of our sections at Doctors Without Borders is working in Nasser Hospital. They're focusing on maternity, pediatrics, neonatal care. So there are efforts, especially in the south and in the center, but clearly not enough.
You wrote earlier this year that the amount of help that MSF and other aid organisations are able to provide is a joke. What did you mean by that?
The scale of help that is needed is so far beyond what we are able to provide. So what we're doing matters and makes a difference. Don't get me wrong, right? But what all of us are able to provide is a drop in the ocean for what is needed. When you look, when we discussed the North and the fact that they have less than 200 beds for people to go into with no healthcare workers, that here you have one need. When you look at Gaza City, which was the place where you had most people living with the most healthcare facilities that have all been destroyed, today they have less than 200 beds available across a few private hospitals and then Shifa that's barely restarting. When you look at the center middle area of Gaza, which is where now over 1.8 million people are, there is not enough from a health structure standpoint, we just can't answer the needs. And then we haven't talked about water and sanitation, which is a topic that's intimately related to health. If I have dirty water, I will have diseases, right? I will have, and we saw this during this summer, big skin diseases because the waters are so dirty. And so all these things, we are unable to scale up. We're not able to bring chlorine inside Gaza. We are restricted as to the types of water and sanitation items we can bring in. We cannot repair broken water pipes. We cannot bring in desalination plants or pieces to repair a broken one. So these are massive challenges that make it so that what we are able to do is very small compared to what the needs are.
So can you describe to me what an average day for you looks like? What do you see when you get into the field hospital, and what sort of cases are you dealing with?
Yeah, so we have two facilities that aim to really answer Gaza's most critical needs when it comes to health. The first one is what we've been doing since the beginning, which is trauma and trauma surgery cases, so plastics, orthoplastics, victims of war most of the time. So doing surgeries, doing wound care management, physiotherapy, mental health, everything related to that. And then we have on the pediatric side of things, we just started a field hospital in Deir al-Balah to really enhance the capacity in Gaza for pediatric care. We started this maybe a couple weeks ago, and we're seeing quite a few cases, and we're looking forward to expanding. These are kids that are coming in with all kinds of conditions, but for now, it's mostly upper respiratory illnesses. So, and we anticipate with the winter coming and the dire living conditions that people face, we expect a lot more severe upper respiratory illnesses.
And finally, I'm just wondering, I know you've previously helped battle Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You've worked in wartime in Mosul in Iraq. You've worked in refugee camps in Lebanon and Bangladesh. How does working in Gaza compare?
Well, working in Gaza is incredibly unique in the sense that you have a people who are not able to leave. They are trapped in a very small amount of space. They have one of the most powerful and sophisticated armies in the world, with support of the United States, pounding on them every day, relentlessly. You have a world that is completely, it's going to be strong words, but that feels like it has been lobotomized and is not able to say anything about what is going on. We have been looking at this disaster, at this daily catastrophe. Every day we have dozens of people killed, and nobody is actively doing something. I'm hearing words, I'm not seeing any actions. The people on the ground, the international NGOs on the ground, the United Nations on the ground are trying so hard to work, but we can't do the work on our own. We need to have the support of the global community. For me, Palestinians have become collateral damage to Israel's rage. And we need that to stop. I think the organizations have said this time and again, but we really need the world to actually do something about that. We can scream all we want from inside. We see all kinds of things. We've been saying it. We try to work, but it takes more than us inside of Gaza to change things. We really need everybody to wake up and to actually do something about it, not just talk about it or look away.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's Karin Huster, an MSF nurse in Gaza. That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis, and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.